It began with a simple gesture. 12 pages of scripted apologies carefully drafted by foreign diplomats were placed on the desk of a young African president. The world expected him to read them, bow politely, and move on. Instead, Ibrahim Traoré folded those 12 pages, slipped them into his pocket, and stood tall before the United Nations. That one motion shattered 4 centuries of silence. The contrast could not have been greater. On one side, an international system designed to discipline, humiliate, and control. On the other, a young captain from a landlocked country daring to defy it all. The United Nations expected submission, but what it received was a roar, a voice that refused to apologize not just for Burkina Faso, but for an entire continent that had carried the weight of exploitation, colonization, and conditional aid for generations. Imagine being in that hall in New York, diplomats leaning forward, waiting for signs of weakness. Journalists prepared to headline Africa Bends once again, and then nothing of the sort. Instead, the microphone echoed with a question so sharp it silenced the room. Before asking me to apologize, how many times have you apologized to Africa? In that instant, the balance of power shifted. What was supposed to be a ceremony of submission became a declaration of dignity. But here is the deeper question. What does it mean for all of us when one leader with nothing more than his voice dares to stand against centuries of domination? Can words alone undo the machinery of control that has dictated Africa's place in the world? Or does this moment signal something larger, the beginning of a continental awakening that no sanctions, no threats, and no scripted documents can contain? Before we answer, I invite you to reflect with me on this extraordinary story. Please share if you feel that you are among the first to truly recognize and support President Ibrahim Traoré's stand. And subscribe if you believe, as I do, that the truth is far more important than the headlines. The confrontation did not erupt overnight. It had been building for weeks: quiet phone calls, veiled threats, and carefully written documents. 2 months before the storm in New York, Ibrahim Traoré delivered a speech that rattled the foundations of international diplomacy. He spoke bluntly about Gaza, about the persistence of French interference in Africa, and about the hypocrisy of those who preach democracy while funding wars. That speech triggered tremors in the corridors of power. And from that moment, every lever of international pressure was set in motion. The process followed a familiar script. Calls from Paris urged him to tone down his rhetoric. Washington offered partnerships that were little more than conditional aid. Tel Aviv sent sharp reminders of cooperation that came with strings attached. Each sentence carried the weight of an ultimatum. Then came the document, 12 pages long, typed and bound, stamped with diplomatic insignia. It was not a suggestion, it was a demand. Read this text, they told him, and the sanctions will vanish. Read it, and the aid will continue to flow. Refuse, and you will face isolation. But the pressure did not stop at paperwork. One night in the dim corridors of the presidential palace in Ouagadougou, the American ambassador arrived with a briefcase. Inside were files that laid bare how closely Burkina Faso was being watched. Gold mines mapped with precision. Contracts with China, Russia, and Iran listed one by one. Even pharmaceutical agreements traced and annotated. The message was unmistakable. We know everything, and because we know everything, we can do anything. Many leaders would have yielded. For a small, landlocked country already battered by insecurity and dependent on international funds, the cost of resistance seemed unbearable. But Traoré chose a different path. Instead of signing or surrendering, he set a trap of his own. He instructed his security chief to spread a rumor that he was preparing to capitulate. Within hours, Western embassies breathed a sigh of relief. Diplomats sent cables home announcing that the young captain had softened. News outlets joined the chorus. CNN reported a more conciliatory stance. The BBC spoke of a search for compromise. The machinery of manipulation thought it had won. Yet just beyond the headlines, a different reality was unfolding. In Ouagadougou's Revolution Square, more than 50,000 citizens gathered. Old women wept openly, young men raised their fists, children waved the red, green, and gold flag of Burkina Faso. They were not waiting for apologies, they were demanding resistance. They wanted their president to embody what their ancestors had died defending: dignity without compromise. The paradox was striking. In Western capitals, relief that Traoré would finally bend. In the streets of Burkina Faso, a swelling tide of expectation that he would not. Two worlds, two narratives colliding head-on. And at the center of it all was one man holding 12 pages of carefully drafted humiliation in his hand and deciding to fold them away. This was the stage as the journey to New York began. On the flight, even his own foreign minister urged moderation. We can soften the tone without conceding the substance, he advised. But Traoré's reply was as cold as it was clear. An apology creates a precedent. A confession today becomes a chain tomorrow. When the plane landed at JFK, the scale of the confrontation became undeniable. 200 members of the African diaspora stood waiting, holding placards that read, "Africa does not apologize." The ride into Manhattan became an improvised protest march. What had started as a diplomatic dispute between one country and the United Nations was already transforming into a continental struggle, and even more, a global rallying cry. This was the essence of the event, a battle not fought with weapons, but with words, not waged on the battlefield, but in the symbolic heart of the international order. The world expected submission. Burkina Faso prepared defiance. The air inside the United Nations General Assembly was heavy with expectation. More than 100 delegations sat in silence waiting. Some leaned forward, eagerly convinced they would witness the humiliation of a defiant African leader finally tamed. Others, especially from the global south, waited with a mix of hope and dread. Would he bend or would he resist? Ibrahim Traoré walked to the podium without notes, without papers, without the 12-page script of apologies that had been handed to him. He adjusted the microphone, paused, and then launched words that cut like steel. "Before asking me to apologize, let me ask you, how many times have you apologized to Africa?" The question fell into the hall like a thunderclap. Diplomats stiffened in their seats. Some whispered frantically to aides. Others averted their gaze. The machinery of discipline, carefully prepared, rehearsed, and anticipated, was breaking down in real time. Instead of reciting admissions of guilt drafted by foreign chanceries, Traoré spoke from memory with the weight of history behind him. He named names, places, wounds still bleeding: Congo, Algeria, Gaza. Each word was not an abstract reference but a scar. Each example a reminder of debts unpaid, lives lost, voices silenced. The translators stumbled to keep pace. Cameras zoomed in on the faces of ambassadors who looked as though the ground beneath them had shifted. What was intended as a ceremonial apology had turned into an inverted trial. It was no longer Ibrahim Traoré on the defensive, it was the world's powers who found themselves accused. Every sentence he uttered was a reversal, humiliation transformed into accusation, submission into defiance. For nearly 3 hours he held the assembly in his grip. No pages, no notes, only conviction. He spoke of the Sahel, where foreign interventions had failed to bring peace. He spoke of aid that arrived with one hand and took back with the other. He spoke of African youth who no longer accepted the chains of dependency. With each passing minute, the balance of power tilted further. Then came the ripple effects. Within hours of the speech, 43 African ambassadors convened in an emergency meeting in New York. Never in recent memory had so many African representatives united so quickly. Their conclusion was simple and historic: no African nation will accept aid conditioned on political submission. The New York Declaration, as it came to be called, was signed by 12 heads of state within days. It was no longer just the defiance of one captain, it had become the collective stand of a continent. The streets reacted with equal force. In Ouagadougou, the 50,000 who had gathered erupted in chants when news reached them. In Nairobi, students organized a day of dignity. In Lagos Market, women refused to sell goods linked to Israeli settlements. In Accra, musicians composed songs using Traoré's very words as lyrics. In Harlem, diaspora communities marched with banners reading "No Apology." But not everyone celebrated. Western chancelleries moved fast to contain the damage. The European Union froze $27 million in development funds. The IMF suspended a debt review. French media launched smear campaigns painting Traoré as reckless, even dictatorial. Yet paradoxically, every attempt to punish only amplified his message. Each sanction was reframed by African voices, not as isolation, but as proof of freedom. In Washington, the reactions were divided. Conservative commentators on Fox News derided Burkina Faso as a Trojan horse for Moscow and Beijing. But progressive figures like Ilhan Omar and Cory Booker openly praised the courage to say no to humiliation. Anthony Blinken, the former Secretary of State, warned that silencing Africa in this way was short-sighted policy that breaks more bridges than it builds. In that moment, the world realized it was not simply watching a speech, it was witnessing a shift in narrative power. The story had escaped the control of those who thought they wrote history. It now belonged to millions from the Sahel to the Caribbean to the streets of America. The climax was clear: 12 pages of scripted submission had been replaced by 3 hours of unscripted sovereignty. The roar of a single voice had become the anthem of a continent. And the reaction, immediate, widespread, unstoppable, signaled that what happened in New York was not an isolated defiance, but the birth of something larger. The aftermath of Ibrahim Traoré's defiant stand rippled far beyond the walls of the United Nations. What began as a moment of symbolic resistance quickly hardened into real political, economic, and social consequences, both for Burkina Faso and for the continent at large. Inside, Burkina Faso legitimacy took on a new meaning. The gathering of 50,000 people in Revolution Square before Traoré's departure had already signaled the mood of the nation, but after the speech, the celebration became something deeper. Women who had wept in the square now described his words as a personal victory. Youth groups that had long felt excluded from politics declared that the president's defiance gave them a voice on the global stage. Even elders who had witnessed the first independent struggles of the 1960s said openly that this moment felt like a continuation of that unfinished fight. It was not merely about applause, it was about reclaiming dignity as a living, breathing political force. Externally, the backlash was swift. Within 48 hours, the European Union announced the freezing of $27 million in development assistance. The IMF suspended a scheduled review of Burkina Faso's debt restructuring program, sending a clear warning to other African nations: this is the cost of rebellion. French media went on the offensive, portraying Traoré as a dangerous populist, a dictator in the making, too reckless to be trusted with international partnerships. Western analysts predicted economic collapse, political instability, and eventual capitulation. But on the streets of Ouagadougou, the opposite sentiment prevailed. Each new sanction was reframed as a badge of honor. Citizens repeated slogans: what they call isolation, we call freedom. The paradox deepened: measures meant to punish instead solidified popular support. Rather than breaking morale, they built resilience. Meanwhile, new doors began to open. Russia and China accelerated agricultural and infrastructure cooperation. Iran dispatched doctors and pharmaceutical experts to fill gaps left by suspended Western programs. These were not merely tactical alliances. They were symbolic lifelines, proof that alternative partnerships were possible. The term Traoré effect began to circulate in diplomatic circles, a shorthand for the unexpected outcomes when a small African nation refused to bow. Politically across Africa, the effects were even more profound. The emergency meeting of 43 African ambassadors had already produced the New York Declaration, but within days, 12 heads of state had signed on to the principle that no aid should ever again be tied to political submission. This was not rhetoric. It was a legal precedent, a line in the sand. For the first time in decades, African leaders had coordinated not around external pressure but around their own terms. Civil society movements amplified the momentum. In Nairobi, students turned their campus into a forum staging debates under the banner Dignity First. In Lagos Market, women organized boycotts of imported goods linked to Israel's settlements. In Accra, musicians recorded new songs weaving Traoré's defiant phrases into the rhythms of highlife and reggae. Across the diaspora, from Harlem to Kingston, from Paris to Sydney, the phrase "no apology" took on a life of its own. Yet the political stakes remained high. Western powers doubled down on warnings, painting the rebellion as unsustainable. But the damage to the old order was already done. The image of one leader refusing to sign 12 pages of scripted submission had altered the expectations of millions. Other African presidents now faced a new benchmark. If Burkina Faso could resist, what excuse did they have not to? Thus, the civil and political consequences unfolded on two levels: punishment from abroad, empowerment at home. And in between, a new African narrative began to take shape: sovereignty, not as an abstract ideal, but as a lived reality, carried by ordinary citizens and defended by their leaders. From Washington to Brussels, from Latin America to the Pacific, the reverberations of Ibrahim Traoré's defiant stand reached far beyond Africa. The episode forced governments, commentators, and citizens alike to confront an uncomfortable question. What does it mean when the weakest refuse to submit to the strongest? In the United States, the reactions revealed a deep divide. On conservative platforms such as Fox News, commentators painted Burkina Faso as nothing more than a Trojan horse for Moscow and Beijing, warning that Traoré's speech was evidence of Africa slipping into the orbit of rival powers. Some Republican senators applauded the suspension of visas for Burkina students and workers, framing it as a necessary measure to protect American security. To them, Burkina Faso's defiance was not a matter of dignity, but a geopolitical threat. Yet the counter-narrative was equally strong. Progressive voices in Congress, including Ilhan Omar and Cory Booker, condemned the sanctions and applauded Traoré's courage. This is not about Russia or China. Omar declared this is about young Africans who believed in freedom and justice, and we should not be the ones breaking their dreams. Former Secretary of State Anthony Blinken criticized the administration's reaction as short-sighted and counterproductive, warning that America risked alienating a generation of Africans by responding with punishment rather than dialogue. The American public, especially the diaspora, reacted with passion. In Harlem, church leaders organized vigils under the slogan "No Apology." At universities across the Midwest, African student associations hosted forums connecting Traoré's speech to the civil rights struggles of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. For older Americans who had lived through the Vietnam War or the fight against apartheid, the resonance was immediate. They recognized the familiar rhythm of a small voice speaking truth to power. In Europe, the reflex was defensive. Brussels froze $27 million in development aid, while Parisian media launched daily smear campaigns branding Traoré reckless, unstable, even dictatorial. But these portrayals only deepened the sense that Europe feared the loss of control more than it feared instability. Ordinary citizens, however, were less convinced. Student groups in Spain and Italy rallied in support of Burkina Faso, comparing the speech to their own struggles against austerity and inequality. Beyond the West, the effect was electric. In Latin America, indigenous movements in Bolivia and Brazil cited Traoré's words as validation of their fight for land rights and cultural sovereignty. In the Caribbean, the memory of anti-colonial revolutions was reignited. Jamaican and Haitian commentators openly called Burkina Faso's defiance a continuation of their own unfinished struggles. Even in Australia, Aboriginal leaders quoted "No Apology" as a rallying cry against centuries of marginalization. Global media could not ignore the moment. CNN and BBC, which had prematurely announced Traoré's conciliatory stance, now scrambled to reframe their coverage. Independent outlets, meanwhile, called it the most important African speech since Nelson Mandela. On social media, clips of the speech went viral, subtitled in Spanish, Arabic, and Mandarin. In the corridors of power, the phrase "the Traoré effect" began to circulate. It captured the essence of what had happened. A single act of defiance by a leader of a small, landlocked nation had forced the world to confront its own hypocrisy and had turned Africa from object to subject in the global story. Whether seen as a threat, a warning, or an inspiration, one fact was undeniable: the world would no longer speak about Africa without listening to Africa's voice. In the end, what remains is not only the image of a young president standing at a podium in New York, it is the chain of consequences unleashed by his refusal. Ibrahim Traoré did more than fold 12 pages of submission into his pocket. He folded 4 centuries of silence and declared them over. His words have already reshaped alliances, unsettled financial institutions, and stirred millions of ordinary citizens across continents. But the question that lingers is sobering: how far can dignity go when confronted with the crushing weight of global power? 3 possible futures now hang in the balance. The first is the path of resilience under strain. Burkina Faso resists sanctions, intensify the economy slows, but the spirit of sovereignty endures. The second is the optimistic path the Traoré effect spreads across Africa, inspiring neighbors to renegotiate contracts, resist conditional aid, and move toward real integration. In this vision, isolation becomes the seed of a new continental unity. The third is the darker possibility: Western reprisals deepen, resources dry up, and internal divisions resurface. Sovereignty without economic safety nets becomes perilous. None of these scenarios are guaranteed, but all of them prove one thing: the precedent has been set, and it cannot be erased. Yet beyond geopolitics lies a more intimate question, one that reaches every household, every heart. For the people of Burkina Faso, hearing their leader refuse humiliation was a personal victory. For the African diaspora in Harlem, Kingston, and Paris, it was a reminder of roots that cannot be severed. For activists in Latin America, for indigenous voices in Australia, it was proof that the language of resistance is universal. And for older Americans, many of whom once marched against segregation, against Vietnam, against apartheid, it was a familiar echo, the sound of truth spoken against impossible odds. That is why this story matters. It is not only about Africa. It is about all of us who have ever been asked to shrink, to apologize, to accept less than we deserve in order to survive. Traoré's act reminds us that silence may be safe, but it is not dignity. So I leave you with this question: what is the one thing a people or a person should never have to apologize for? If this story resonates with you, please share it. If you believe, like I do, that President Ibrahim Traoré's defiance speaks to something greater than politics, that it speaks to the human need for dignity, then let your voice be part of this conversation. Subscribe if you believe the truth is more important than the headlines, because dignity once defended belongs to all of us.